How to detach from everything that drains you, Shi Heng Yi wisdom. There comes a moment in every life when you realize that certain people, habits, and situations are quietly draining your energy faster than you can replace it. Shaolin wisdom teaches that the path to true peace is not found in fighting harder against these drains, but in learning the disciplined art of detachment. Today we explore how to release what no longer serves you without becoming cold, bitter, or closed off from life itself. Before we begin, subscribe to this channel so this wisdom reaches you whenever you need it most. Let us begin this journey toward lighter living. Teaching 1. Understanding what detachment truly means. Many people misunderstand detachment as coldness, believing that releasing what drains them requires becoming indifferent to everything and everyone around them. Shaolin teaching corrects this misunderstanding immediately, explaining that true detachment is not the absence of caring, but the release of desperate clinging. A monk who has mastered detachment still feels compassion, still forms bonds, and still experiences the full range of human emotion, yet he does so without the suffocating grip that turns love into dependency and care into control. The difference lies in the quality of the hold. Attachment says that your peace depends entirely on a specific outcome, a specific person remaining exactly as they are, or a specific situation resolving in your favor. Detachment says that you can care deeply about an outcome while remaining whole regardless of how it unfolds. This distinction matters because it is precisely the desperate grip of attachment, not the caring itself, that creates the exhausting drain so many people feel in their relationships, careers, and daily routines. Learning to loosen this grip, without abandoning care altogether, is the foundation upon which every other teaching in this story will be built. Teaching 2. Identifying what is actually draining you. Before detachment becomes possible, a person must first develop the clarity to identify precisely what is draining their energy, since many people live for years feeling exhausted without ever properly naming the source. Shaolin teaching encourages a practice of honest self-observation, sitting quietly and mentally reviewing the different relationships, obligations, and habits that fill an average week, paying close attention to how the body and mind respond to each one. Notice how certain people leave you feeling energized after spending time with them, while others leave you feeling depleted even after a pleasant-seeming conversation. Notice how certain obligations feel purposeful even when difficult, while others feel hollow and exhausting regardless of how simple they might appear. This honest inventory often reveals surprising truths, such as discovering that a friendship maintained purely out of guilt or history has been quietly draining you for years, or that a daily habit assumed to be relaxing is actually a subtle source of anxiety. Shaolin wisdom insists that clarity must always precede action, for you cannot release what you have not yet honestly identified, and vague dissatisfaction without clear diagnosis rarely leads to lasting change. Teaching 3. Releasing the fear of disappointing others. One of the greatest obstacles preventing people from detaching from draining relationships and obligations is the deep fear of disappointing others, a fear so powerful that many would rather exhaust themselves indefinitely than risk someone else's temporary displeasure. Shaolin teaching addresses this fear directly, explaining that a life spent entirely in service of avoiding other people's disappointment is not a life of peace, but a life of quiet servitude to expectations that were often never fair to begin with. Consider honestly how much of your daily exhaustion stems from genuine desire versus obligation rooted purely in fear of judgment. Shaolin monks are taught that disappointing someone through honest boundary setting is far less damaging, both to yourself and ultimately to the relationship, than slowly poisoning that same relationship with quiet resentment built from years of self-sacrifice. People who truly respect you will adjust to your honest boundaries, even if disappointed initially, while those who only valued your endless availability will reveal their true nature the moment you stop providing it without limit. Learning to tolerate the discomfort of someone else's temporary disappointment, without abandoning your own well-being to prevent it, is an essential skill on the path toward sustainable detachment. Subscribe to this channel now if this teaching is speaking to something you have been carrying for far too long, because there is much more wisdom ahead. Teaching 4. The practice of emotional non-attachment. Shaolin monks train extensively in a practice sometimes translated as emotional non-attachment, which involves observing emotions as they arise without immediately grasping onto them or building elaborate stories around their presence. When anger arises, for example, the untrained mind immediately begins constructing justifications, replaying the offending situation repeatedly, and feeding the emotion until it grows far beyond its original intensity. The trained mind, by contrast, notices anger arising, acknowledges its presence honestly, and allows it to pass through without unnecessary amplification. This practice applies directly to the exhaustion caused by draining relationships and situations. When someone says something hurtful or disappointing, the untrained response is to immediately spiral into extended rumination, replaying the interaction for hours or days, exhausting emotional reserves that could otherwise be spent on genuinely nourishing pursuits. The trained response acknowledges the hurt honestly in the moment, perhaps even expresses it directly to the person responsible if appropriate, but does not continue feeding the wound through endless mental repetition afterward. Shaolin wisdom teaches that emotions, like weather, naturally pass through when not artificially prolonged by our own mental habits, and much of the exhaustion people attribute to draining people is actually self-inflicted through the habit of excessive rumination rather than the original incident itself. Teaching 5. Distinguishing between helping and enabling. A particularly exhausting pattern many people fall into involves confusing genuine helping with quiet enabling, repeatedly rescuing someone from consequences that could otherwise teach them valuable growth, while slowly depleting their own energy in the process. Shaolin teaching draws a clear distinction between these two behaviors, one rooted in genuine compassion and the other rooted in a subtle need to be needed, or an inability to tolerate watching someone else struggle even when that struggle serves an important purpose. True helping empowers another person toward eventual independence, offering support that strengthens their own capacity to handle future challenges without perpetual rescue. Enabling, by contrast, creates a cycle of dependency, where the helper continuously absorbs the consequences that should rightfully belong to the person being helped, exhausting themselves while inadvertently preventing the other person's growth entirely. Ask yourself honestly whether your continued involvement in a draining situation is truly serving the other person's long-term well-being, or whether it is simply preventing an uncomfortable but necessary lesson from unfolding naturally. Shaolin wisdom teaches that sometimes the most compassionate action available is to step back entirely, allowing natural consequences to teach what your continued intervention has been quietly preventing for far too long. Teaching 6. The discipline of saying no without guilt. Perhaps no skill contributes more directly to detachment from draining obligations than the disciplined practice of saying no without attaching guilt to the refusal. Shaolin monks train for years to develop this capacity, understanding that every single yes granted to one obligation is simultaneously a no granted, whether consciously or not, to something else entirely, whether that be rest, personal growth, or more meaningful relationships and pursuits. Most people say yes reflexively, driven by ingrained habits of pleasing others or avoiding uncomfortable confrontation, without ever pausing to consider whether the request truly deserves their limited time and energy. Shaolin practice encourages a brief pause before any commitment, however small, allowing space to honestly assess whether saying yes aligns with genuine values and priorities, or whether it merely satisfies an old habit of automatic compliance. When the honest answer is no, the discipline lies in delivering that answer clearly and without excessive apology or extended justification, understanding that a simple, respectful decline requires no lengthy defense to be legitimate. Shaolin wisdom teaches that guilt attached to healthy boundaries is often inherited conditioning rather than genuine moral obligation, and releasing this inherited guilt is essential for anyone hoping to detach successfully from the countless small obligations that collectively drain an entire life. If this teaching is helping you find clarity, please subscribe to this channel, because the deepest lessons of this journey are still ahead of us. Teaching 7. Detaching from the need for approval. Among the most exhausting patterns a person can carry through life is the constant need for external approval, a hunger that can never truly be satisfied no matter how much validation is received, since the need itself originates from an internal void rather than an external deficiency. Shaolin teaching identifies this need for approval as one of the heaviest burdens a person can carry, since it hands enormous power over one's peace to the ever-changing opinions of others. Consider how much energy is spent throughout an average day anticipating how others will judge your choices, your appearance, your career path, or your personal values. This constant anticipation, largely invisible even to the person carrying it, represents a significant and continuous drain on available energy that could otherwise be directed toward genuinely meaningful pursuits. Shaolin practice encourages a gradual process of internal validation, learning to assess your own choices against your own values and standards rather than the shifting expectations of an audience that will never be fully satisfied regardless of how much you sacrifice to please them. This does not mean disregarding all feedback or becoming arrogantly closed to growth, but rather developing an internal compass strong enough that external approval becomes a pleasant addition to life rather than its essential foundation. Teaching 8. Releasing attachment to how things should be. A significant source of chronic exhaustion stems from rigid attachment to how situations, relationships, and outcomes should unfold, according to expectations often formed years earlier and rarely revisited or questioned. Shaolin teaching explains that suffering frequently arises not from reality itself, but from the persistent gap between reality as it actually exists and our stubborn insistence on how it should have been instead. This attachment to expectation appears everywhere throughout daily life, from frustration when a friend fails to respond exactly as anticipated, to prolonged grief when a career path deviates from an early vision established during youth. Shaolin practice encourages a gradual softening of these rigid expectations, not through resignation or apathy, but through genuine acceptance of reality as the necessary starting point for any meaningful action moving forward. This acceptance does not mean abandoning goals or ambitions entirely, but releasing the exhausting insistence that reality must conform precisely to a predetermined mental script before peace becomes possible. When you release attachment to how things should be, remarkable energy becomes available, energy previously spent resisting reality that can now be redirected toward navigating reality skillfully as it actually presents itself in each present moment. Teaching 9. The wisdom of selective engagement. As detachment deepens, an important skill emerges known as selective engagement, the disciplined practice of choosing carefully which battles, conversations, and situations genuinely deserve your limited energy, rather than engaging reflexively with every provocation, request, or drama that crosses your path throughout an average day. Shaolin monks describe this practice using the metaphor of water flowing around obstacles rather than crashing directly into every single one encountered along its journey. This does not mean avoiding all conflict or difficulty, for some situations genuinely require direct engagement despite their difficulty. Rather, selective engagement means developing the discernment to distinguish between conflicts that matter deeply to your values and those that are simply noise, drama, or provocation designed to pull you into an exhausting cycle that ultimately serves no meaningful purpose. Before engaging with any draining situation, pause to ask whether this particular battle genuinely aligns with your deeper values and priorities, or whether it is simply an old reflexive habit of engaging with anything and everything that demands your attention. Shaolin wisdom teaches that this selective engagement, practiced consistently over time, dramatically reduces the overall drain experienced throughout daily life, preserving precious energy for the relationships and pursuits that truly deserve it. You are absorbing some of the deepest wisdom in this entire story, so if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, now is the perfect moment to join us. Teaching 10. Grieving what you release. An often overlooked aspect of detachment involves the necessary process of grieving what you choose to release, whether that be a long-standing friendship that no longer serves either party, a career path abandoned in favor of healthier priorities, or an old identity built entirely around being endlessly available to others. Shaolin teaching acknowledges honestly that even healthy detachment often involves genuine loss, and pretending otherwise only delays the necessary emotional processing required for true peace to follow. Allow yourself to honestly grieve what detachment requires you to release, rather than forcing an artificial cheerfulness that denies the genuine difficulty of the transition. This grief might include mourning the version of a relationship that once felt nourishing before it slowly became draining, or mourning the loss of an identity built around being perpetually helpful even at significant personal cost. Shaolin wisdom teaches that grief honestly processed passes through relatively quickly, while grief denied or suppressed tends to resurface repeatedly in unexpected forms, undermining the very detachment you have worked so hard to achieve. Give yourself full permission to feel the genuine loss involved in releasing what no longer serves you, understanding that this grief is not evidence you made the wrong choice, but simply evidence that you are human, releasing something that once held genuine meaning in your life. Teaching 11. Building a life that requires less escape. As detachment from draining people and situations deepens, an important shift often emerges naturally, a gradual reduction in the desire to escape through distraction, since a life increasingly filled with genuinely nourishing relationships and pursuits requires far less numbing than a life still weighed down by unresolved drains. Shaolin teaching observes that many common escape habits, excessive entertainment, compulsive scrolling, overeating, or substance use, often function as attempts to temporarily numb the exhaustion caused by unaddressed draining relationships and obligations rather than genuine sources of joy in their own right. As you successfully detach from what has been quietly exhausting you, notice whether your reliance on these escape habits naturally begins to soften without requiring extraordinary willpower to resist them. This is not a coincidence, but direct evidence of the underlying principle Shaolin teaching has long emphasized, that many destructive habits are secondary symptoms of an underlying drain rather than the primary problem requiring correction. Address the root cause honestly through disciplined detachment, and many surface-level struggles that once seemed impossible to overcome often diminish naturally as a welcome side effect, freeing even more energy that can then be redirected toward building the kind of life that requires little escape because it already feels genuinely worth living each day. Teaching 12. Detachment is an ongoing practice, not a final destination. It is important to understand that detachment is not a single achievement to be completed once and then permanently maintained without further effort, but an ongoing practice requiring continuous attention throughout an entire lifetime. Shaolin monks who have practiced detachment for decades still encounter moments of unhealthy attachment arising unexpectedly, whether toward a new relationship, an unexpected outcome, or an old habit resurfacing during a period of particular stress or vulnerability. Rather than viewing these moments as failures that undo years of progress, Shaolin teaching encourages viewing them simply as natural opportunities to return once again to the practice, applying the same principles of honest observation, gradual release, and compassionate acceptance discussed throughout this story. The goal was never to achieve a permanent, unshakable state of perfect detachment beyond all human struggle, but to develop increasing skill at noticing unhealthy attachment more quickly each time it arises, and returning to balance with greater ease and less prolonged suffering than in years past. This ongoing, patient practice, rather than any single dramatic breakthrough, is ultimately what separates those who successfully build lighter, more sustainable lives from those who briefly experience temporary relief before slowly sliding back into the same exhausting patterns they once hoped to escape entirely. Closing reflection. Detaching from everything that drains you is not about becoming cold, isolated, or indifferent to the world around you, but about developing the wisdom to distinguish between connections that nourish your life and obligations that quietly exhaust it beyond what any relationship or commitment should reasonably demand. Through honest self-observation, the courage to disappoint others when necessary, the discipline of saying no without excessive guilt, and the patience to grieve what must be released, a lighter and more sustainable way of living gradually becomes available. Shaolin wisdom reminds us that this is not a single achievement but an ongoing practice, one that rewards consistent effort with increasing peace, clarity, and energy for the pursuits and relationships that genuinely deserve your limited time on this earth. If this story has given you the clarity or permission you have been searching for, please subscribe to this channel right now so you never miss the wisdom still to come. Share this video with someone who has been quietly exhausted for far too long. Leave a comment about which teaching resonated with you most deeply, and join this growing community dedicated to building lighter, more intentional lives. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next story.